Good morning. I suppose we're all here, those of us who are here for the technology presentation. So this is the tech track. My name is Claude Goodman. I'm a biomedical engineer by training, a gerontechnologist by choice. My background is in technology transfer from national institutes and laboratories to domestic industry, primarily in digital radiology. In 2001, I founded CareWheels as an Oregon 501c3 nonprofit to perform research and development in gerontechnology to provide TeleCare services to people of all ages living with disabilities, and particularly the growing population of frail elders. So, the theme today is disrupt aging. Disrupt's an interesting word. First definition is to cause disorder or turmoil. Second definition, to destroy, usually temporarily. Dr. Bill Thomas, who we're kind of honoring with the disrupt aging concept today, says that my favorite Einstein quote goes like this: "For an idea that does not first seem insane, there is no hope." The best new ideas, the ones with the most potential to disrupt and transform the experience of care and caregiving, are also the most likely to be rejected out of hand. I'll show you one of those ideas today. The concept of disruptive innovation comes from Professor Clayton Christensen over at the Harvard Business School, and he defines disruptive innovation as a process by which a product or service takes root initially in simple applications at the bottom of the market and then relentlessly moves upmarket, eventually displacing established competitors. So the topics for my presentation today, in order, are disruptive demographics, disruptive technology, disruptive innovation adoption, sensible disruption — I hope I'm disrupting enough with all of these things — informed decision making, then some examples of technologies for aging in place, and finally the work that I'm doing on the Interdependent Care, or iCare, CareBank model. So without further ado, 10 years ago, most of us were in denial. Has anything changed? This is the January 1st, 2006 Sunday Oregonian. Front page, we have a financial disaster looming, and most of us are in denial, according to Dr. Bruce Goldberg, who was then the head of DHS. So I like to do 10-year retrospectives. I'll be doing another one shortly to kind of put where we are today in perspective. So where are we today? Portlandia is where young people come to retire, right? It's also where boomers stay. If you look at the 2010 census, and then look at the difference between the 2000 and 2010 census, you see two humps on this camel: millennials and boomers. This is our present, and this is the future that we're moving into. And what does this future look like? Well, a fundamental shift in demographics. We see that the population is getting older, and particularly the oldest old, those 84 years and older, are the fastest growing cohort. And what does this mean? It means, for one thing, that the classic population pyramid is flattening out. What it also means is that we're seeing a caregiver gap. The difference between the population that historically serves as care providers and the population that's going to need them. So how are we going to address this? Back to the 10-year retrospective. I revisited this document. In 2006, ASA, the American Association of Homes and Services for the Aging, renamed as Leading Age, did a bunch of scenario planning. They organized intensive rounds of interviews with a range of stakeholders from healthcare, government, business, and consumer advocacy groups. They made a wide variety of thoughtful predictions about the state of aging in 2016. Their predictions are framed in 4 divergent scenarios that span a wide range of possible futures, most of which have been disrupted by the 2008 financial crisis and its repercussions, something that Ted Weirley touched upon this morning. So the report and scenarios were named kind of cutely after some popular Beatles songs. So what we're seeing here on the left is the matrix. And what they were looking at is uncertainty in terms of consumer behavior, from evolutionary to revolutionary behavior, and uncertainty in talent availability, from scarce to resolved. The scenarios give a good sense of the bold thinking around 2006 and how inadequate our collective imagination and options have become in 2016. Scenario C, yesterday, is the most disturbing because of its eerie familiarity. A few haves, many have-nots, economic stagnation, deep political divisions that have precluded the revolutionary advances described in the other scenarios. In retrospect, technology has yet to deliver its promise, and the Community Living Assistance Services and Support Act is dead. In 2011, the Obama administration announced that the Class Act was unworkable and it was repealed in 2013. So there is no plan financing long-term care. What are we going to do? Well, this year, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology reported to the President their final report on independence, technology, and connection in older age. Came to these conclusions. Technology has played an important role in increasing life expectancy, but it also has an important role to play in increasing the quality of life by maximizing Americans' ability to function in their later years. Telehealth, the process of providing health care by telephone, video conference, email, monitoring, web, etc., can provide many services directly into the home. And monitoring holds great promise for predicting problems and enhancing safety of people at risk. So, now let's look at disruptive technology, and we're going to focus on telehealth. So what is telehealth? You all know the parable of the blind man and the elephant, old Sufi parable? Okay, so what is telehealth? Some people think it's a network. No, it's a liability. No, it's a cash cow, right? Well, it's all and none of those things, I suppose. About 15 years ago, I met a guy named Eric Dishman who had just been hired by Intel for their Peoples and Practices group looking at technology for aging in place, and I found a kindred spirit. Eric taught me one of those droll Intel inside terms, success catastrophe. Now, Intel developed this term, they probably say they invented it, to describe the effect of Moore's Law, you know, this doubling of power of microprocessors every year or two. And this presented a success catastrophe to Intel because they were making more and more powerful processors, geometrically increasing the power. And what were people going to do? Read their emails faster? So Intel was looking for ways to leverage their technology. And one of the things that Eric and I realized was that we're dealing with not only disruptive technology, but also disruptive demographics, this aging phenomenon, which is historically unique. So our premise was that these two success catastrophes, disruptive technologies and disruptive demographics, may hold the keys to unlock each other's potential, if we could just figure out how to do that. Eric said global aging is no less urgent or impactful than global warming. Longevity is a societal success catastrophe. So what do we do about it? Well, Eric got together with Dr. Jeffrey Kay over at the Latent Alzheimer's Research Center at OHSU. They got some seed funding, they got some grants, and they developed the Oregon Royal Center for Aging and Technology, now just called the Oregon Center for Aging and Technology, OrcaTech. So around 2005, these were the primary players. There were some in South Oregon, around Medford area, but the anchor tenants were Intel and OHSU, the VA, and there were some companies like CareWheels and Spry, Elite Care. The state universities were involved in this, and we were all looking at how we could use technology in the home. So let me give you a little primer on telehealth. It embraces both telemedicine and TeleCare. Now, telemedicine has been around since the 1960s. It was developed by NASA in order to do astronaut telemetry, to be able to know how the astronauts were doing up in space. Okay? So telemedicine is involved in things like biometric monitoring for chronic disease management. All the various devices that can be used to collect vital signs data and transmit it to a location. The work that I've been doing is involved in TeleCare, which could be defined as behavioral monitoring for embedded assessment and support. And this has more to do with putting sensors in the home to understand what we call people's arc of the day, their observations of daily living. The hypothesis then, and it's coming true now, is that we were going to see a digital home convergence, that telemedicine and telecare services would integrate into the digital home and through the internet do things like populate electronic health records and personal health records, inform healthcare providers and family caregivers, provide monitoring services and so forth. So the work that I was involved in was putting sensors in people's homes and trying to understand what those sensors could do to help people. And the work that I did, which was funded under an Intel Research Council grant, was what we call a living laboratory. There were other experiments going on around the country at MIT and Georgia Tech, for instance, where they would instrument an apartment and have a grad student live in it for a couple of weeks and collect a bunch of data and call that a living lab. Well, what I proposed to do was to do the research with real people in their own homes, and Intel thought I was crazy. Until I suggested that, well, rather than work with frail elders who would be frankly rather lousy beta testers, to work with pre-senescent people with severe disabilities who have some similar cognitive and motor and sensory challenges to frail elders, but who are dynamic, robust, excited to work on this kind of a participatory design research project, and who are marginalized in our culture and really don't have access to powerful computers, rich internet connectivity, and the opportunity to participate and contribute on a research project. So this is an example of one of the apartments that we instrumented. And this is a heavily instrumented apartment. I'm not suggesting that we all need to do this, but to collect basic data and understand how we could use these sensors, we did a lot of censoring. So for example, you see here on the bed there are 2 sensors. And the reason we had to do that is because this person had a big cat. Big cat liked to sleep on the bed. And we needed to, as they say in the data biz, disambiguate, or distinguish between Big Cat and Laura. And so the way that we did this was to have 2 sensors more than a cat's width apart. This is high-tech research, okay? But this is how you do it. Now, I have to say that the most interesting discovery that we made was not about technology. And the technology is very interesting, and we were able to support the work of other research projects by doing some of the initial development in censored living labs. Nicole is going to speak to you more about that in the next presentation, the work at Orchitect. But the most interesting discovery that we made was that when you give people access to their own data, they take better care of themselves. That's not really the big story. We asked people if they would like to share their dashboards, if they'd like to actually monitor each other. These are people who are living in one building in East Portland, the Pine Point Apartments, the Section 8 housing. They were already helping each other out. So when they got the idea that they could cross-monitor and be able to be the monitors and first responders for each other, this turned on a big light. And for some of these people, it was transformative. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. But that was the big takeaway. So let's talk about disruptive innovation adoption. Okay, ends versus means. How many of you own a microwave oven? Can I have a show of hands, please? Almost unanimous, okay? How many of you remember Monty Hall? Okay, I know which group I'm talking to. Monty who? For over a decade, Monty hawked the Amana radar range. Do you remember that? The curtain behind Carol Merrill often had an Amana radar range. How long did it take the radar range to become the ubiquitous microwave oven that's in all of our kitchens? A very long time. Why? Okay, let's talk a little bit about the theory of innovation adoption and ends versus means. So the radar range had this really long, slow adoption. We're looking here at the percent of the population adopting a technology over time. Okay? If we compare that to technologies like the smartphone or email, we see that there are some technologies that have much faster adoption. From the early adopters, all of a sudden you shoot up quickly through the population until you reach saturation. Professor Everett Rogers called this the networked effect of reciprocal interdependence, which simply means that I'll give you a practical example. If I buy a microwave oven, it does you absolutely no good. But if I buy a telephone or a smartphone and become part of a network, then I enrich the whole network. So if you have the technology, you're enriched when I join the network. So one thing that I've observed is that most of the technologies that have been sold into the home market for aging in place have been microwave oven type technologies. They've been ends. We need to figure out how to use these technologies as means, and I'm going to give you a sense of that in following slides. A little bit of history on the Pine Point Living Lab. We set up this living lab for participatory design. It had what was the state-of-the-art technology then, voice-activated control of lights and appliances, voice-activated video phone capability, webcams so that people could hail each other. Some of these people, for example, had quadriplegia. They couldn't handle a keyboard. They couldn't work a computer very well, so it was all voice-activated. There were sensors around the home. What we learned, as I said before, is that society needs people like Laura, okay? There's a before and after picture of Laura. And she demonstrated the relationship between self-esteem and empowerment to overcome a catch-22 in social services provision, by which I mean that when Laura had a stroke in her 40s, and this was a woman who raised 3 children, worked at Tektronix and at OHSU, after her stroke, her care manager told her, look, collect your SSDI check, stay home, watch TV, don't complain, you're never going to work again. You're never going to work again. You know what kind of a hit that takes to a person's self-esteem? Before, experts told her she was permanently disabled. After, she could provide TeleCare services to frail elders in the community. And so Laura's takeaway message was, the moral of the story is, Laura, stop doubting yourself. This is the transformative power of using technology as a means for people to help each other rather than an end. So now let's talk a little bit about the theory of disruptive innovations in healthcare. I introduced you to Professor Clayton Christensen at the beginning of the presentation. He and his group wrote a book called Healing the 800-Pound Gorilla, The Future of Healthcare. And he talks about disruptive innovation, particularly technologies that can cause disruption. And he talks about several kinds. Provider-level disruption is a disruption, and a good example would be like the digital glucometer. Diabetes is a very hard disease to manage. And back in the bad old days, you had to go to a hospital and get blood drawn regularly, measure your insulin, and it was a specialist's job. Okay? But what we've seen over the years is diabetes management has moved from the specialist all the way down to self-care. How is that possible? I believe the reason is because we've taken the expertise of the specialist and we've put it in a little electronic package. We've codified the rules of how to treat diabetes and put it in the hands of anybody who needs it. So that's a provider-level disruption. A point-of-care disruption would be something like the home pregnancy test kit. Once upon a time, a woman had to go to her doctor, have blood drawn, and have a rabbit test done. Now, a little dipstick, and you know the answer too soon. All right? So to Professor Christensen's provider and point-of-care type disruptions, I add a third disruption, which is one that is emergent right now, which I call a prosumer-driven disruption. Any of you remember Alvin and Heidi Toffler, the authors of Future Shock? Future Shock, right? They were writing about the world we're living in right now. They got a lot of it right. That was back in the 60s. In the 80s, they wrote a book called The Third Wave. And they predicted that the power of computers in the hands of regular people was going to move us from the factory model back to the cottage industry model, where we could do for each other from our own homes. And they coined the term prosumer, which is a contraction of producer and consumer, where we would produce and consume goods and services for each other. So I'm going to tell you about home telecare monitoring that moves from community-based health services through tech-empowered care teams to peer care in the community and to self-care at home. So let's talk a little bit about technology in the most general sense. Technology in the healthcare continuum. So we can look at different aspects of the human condition: the subjective, the objective, the cultural, and the social aspects. CareWheels' focus has always been on the left-hand side of this, the subjective, which has to do with empowering the individual, technology for personal empowerment, and technology for interpersonal interaction, the collective or caregiving aspect of technology. But the same technology that CareWheels developed and was using to do self-care and group care, Orchitech at OHSU used to do objective research, to do technology for medical intervention, in the case of being able to identify preclinical dementia and the biomarkers, the characteristics of that. And in fact, by scaling that up, they could actually address the social issues, the whole ecosystem of public health, technology for epidemiological intervention, which is very exciting work that I'm sure Nicole is going to tell you a lot about soon. So understand that the same technology and infrastructure connects through all quadrants of the healthcare continuum. You can do all of this with the same technology. You just have to ask the right questions to get the answers that you want. The next thing I'd like to talk to you about is sensible disruptions, technology for aging in place. So here's where I get geeky with you. I'll talk about the various types of technologies. So a variety of systems are available for elders who are aging in place to monitor activities, detect problems, and respond to emergencies, including personal emergency response systems, the medical alert buttons, video monitoring systems, and sensor-based monitoring systems. So you're probably all familiar with the PERS systems, right? The classic medical alert buttons worn by elders to link them to a central dispatcher who contacts them when the button's pressed, or now with some of the new systems that have an accelerometer built into them so that they can sense falls and call a responder. This technology has been around for a long time, but it's evolving quickly right now. When the Intel, what was then the Oregon Graduate Institute, later became the Biomedical Engineers within OHSU, and myself at CareWheels did our formative research back around 2001. We went and we interviewed home care companies, and particularly their managers. And we asked them, do you use any technology? And they said, oh yeah, we use these call for help buttons and medical alerts. So we asked them, well, how are they working for you? And we heard a very surprising answer. They said, well, they don't work about a third of the time. And the engineers looked around the table, we looked at each other and said, can't we build a better button? But they explained to us, well, it's really not about building a better button. You see, because the problem is sometimes people don't push the button. And we asked why. Well, maybe the person's incapacitated. That's the obvious answer. And obviously the technology won't work if a person's incapacitated. But there were other examples that were a little more disturbing. Some people don't feel comfortable wearing the button because it's like a stigma, right? It's something they wear around their neck that says, I can't take care of myself. So if you're not wearing the button, you can be paying the subscription and it's still not going to do you any good. But the most disturbing answer they told us was that some people fall and don't push the button. They're afraid to push the button because the only reason they ever agreed to wear the button was to stay out of an institution. So we realized we didn't need to build a better button, we needed to build around outside of the button, and that's where we looked at smart home technologies, where the home would be smart enough to quote-unquote push the button. Another unfortunately popular technology is video monitoring systems, okay? Video cameras installed in the elder's home, the granny cams, right, through which caregivers are able to monitor residents from remote locations through web-based systems and intervene if unsafe behaviors are observed. Let me just tell you as a parenthetical aside, don't Google granny cam unless... The first thing that comes up is not technological. Although there are technological devices involved. I personally, my litmus test is this a technology that I would want for my mother? Or is this a technology that I would want to live with myself? And I've spoken to proponents of this kind of technology, researchers who argue that this is the most powerful technology available. And first of all, it isn't so powerful because you have to have eyeballs on it all the time. And that's, otherwise you miss what's going on. But, the old adage that if the only tool you have is a hammer, the whole world starts to look like a nail? Well, my response to these people is, when the only tool you have is a camera, the whole world starts to look like a jail. Who wants to live in that world? Right? 1984. Not my cup of tea. More interesting are sensor-based monitoring systems, a variety of sensors strategically placed around the home, linked to computer systems that collect and analyze activity data to detect habitual activity patterns and deviations from those normal behavioral patterns that may indicate a problem or crisis. Okay? We're talking about very simple sensors, and I'll have a lot more to say about that in a minute. But first, let me give you a little historical perspective. There's a lot of ways to do this. Japan, as you may know, is the oldest country demographically speaking. Well, about 20 years ago, a company called Zojirushi that makes these hot water heater thermos hybrid devices, these highly efficient water heaters, so that you can make tea and ramen and all this, things that require hot water. They invented something called the iPot. This was before the iPad, okay? And the iPot was a hybrid of one of their hot water dispensers and a cell phone, such that every time a person pushed the button to dispense water, it sent a little ping over the cell network that then went ultimately to the family caregiver's computer or smartphone. And you could see normal patterns of activity and deviations from those normal patterns, like this late start where the person missed their breakfast. Now, that may just be that they overslept, maybe that they have the flu, maybe that they're incapacitated. We don't know. It's a very simple bit of data, but it's the kind of thing that you can do where you embed the sensor technology in everyday objects. So this is kind of my imagining of how this works. Mom makes tea. iPod sends data to network. Data goes to the daughter. Mom's just fine. I feel safe. Daughter has peace of mind. That's the model. That's simple. Okay? So would that work here? Maybe not. But how about an iFridge? Okay? So what we did was we put these light and motion sensors actually in the refrigerator. So we could see every time a person opened and closed the refrigerator, and that's a reasonable proxy for the person eating on a schedule. But data is very powerful. For example, we learned through this research that the fridge light actually does go out when the door is closed. We have data to prove it. Glad I could dispel that doubt for you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about informed decision making, factors for evaluating technologies. A fundamental tenet of informed decision-making is that individuals should be able to participate in decisions about their own lives and voluntarily accept or decline the offered technological intervention. The necessary elements include information, comprehension, and voluntariness. So, people need to know information about costs, the lack of insurance reimbursement today, privacy issues, and confidentiality of protected health information, which may not be understood by the elder or their family caregiver. People need comprehension to understand the purpose, the benefits, and limitations of the technology, which may be complicated, for example, in a case where the elder has compromised cognitive abilities. And voluntariness, which sounds a little like truthiness, right? Choosing technological interventions which may reasonably be perceived by the elder as intrusive, stigmatizing, and disempowering. So let's look at levels of service versus need or risk. This is kind of a simplified graph of the decision process, okay? But if a person can live independently, they benefit from having connection to other people. But as their level of need and risks associated with that need increases through IADLs and ADLs, or what Robert Wood Johnson Foundation calls the observations of daily living, which kind of lumps all of these things together. As people's level of need and risk increases, we move from connection to coordination of care services, and finally to monitoring and response. And the thing to appreciate is that, and this is pretty obvious, as the level of service goes up, the cost goes up. It's also important to recognize that privacy usually goes down too. Okay? So what's the value of this? There's a research clinical psychologist at the Intel Digital Health Group named Margie Morris, and she wrote a wonderful paper called Technologies for the Heart and Mind. And one of the things that she began to understand as she interviewed people was that we all have a personal baseline. We're not the same every day, but if you look at our personal health baseline over a period of time, it's pretty stable. I mean, you can kind of draw a straight line through it. But at some point, things begin to change. And most of us are in denial when those changes begin to happen. What Margie recognized was that if we had the opportunity to observe these changes, this opportunity space, before the crisis, we might be able to avert the crisis. This is really important. Because when a person goes through the crisis, first of all, it's the worst time to introduce technology into the home. People just don't have the bandwidth for it, to learn how to use it and so forth. The results are often that while there's an actual level of decline, what Margie learned was that the perceived level of decline is often even lower. In other words, because of guilt and being faced with the consequences of the denial, oftentimes the family will say, well, Mom, now it's time for you to go into the nursing home because obviously you had this terrible crisis. So it's kind of a double whammy for the elder because not only do they take the fall, but they get pushed down lower than they have to go. Factors for evaluating technologies. Well, given the criteria to make an informed decision, given that the criteria have been established, 3 factors should be evaluated when selecting the most appropriate system for a specific individual: effectiveness, obtrusiveness, and quality of life. Effectiveness of technological intervention should be evaluated in terms that are meaningful to the elder and family, including the system reliability, functional limitations, and the data integrity. Obtrusiveness of the technology should be minimized, whether it's perceived to be objectionable, difficult to use, or undermining to personal privacy. And the quality of life considerations based in an individual's values and objectives should include assessment of the effectiveness and obtrusiveness, as well as the impact of monitoring technology on their sense of self-esteem and independence. So let me give you some examples. This is the granddaddy of all in-home care monitoring systems. This was the Quiet Care system developed in the early 2000s by a couple of professors from Drexel University. It became the livingindependently.com business. And this was a rather intelligent system that used 5 little motion sensors to do wellness monitoring, early warning. It had a nice little web-based interface. It used the standard POTS, a plain old telephone system. I know that means something else in modern-day Portland, but simple telephone hookups, all right, and provided email, pager, and text messaging. This is kind of a model of how it works, where you have the elder generating data, which goes to a server for analysis and archiving. The alerts that come out of that data analysis go to a third-party monitoring service like ADT, which then both reports back to, provides services to the elder and to the family caregiver. And interestingly, the technology was also designed to improve communication between the family caregiver and the elder. In other words, if you know that mom's taking her meds and eating meals on time, you don't have to start every phone call with, "Mom, are you taking your meds and eating your meals on time?" You know, right? So it's a different channel of communication. And so we see the dashboard below. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. So they used basic status lights to show how a person was doing over a series of different events. Wake-up time, potential bathroom falls, taking meds. Notice that the meds are grayed out. That's because their lawyer said, don't report this. There are liability issues associated with actually giving a green or a red light about whether they took their meds. So the system generated push alerts. In addition to being able to go to that website, secure dashboard, and see how the person was doing, the system would push out alerts by text and or email. Okay? Interesting thing about the system, the elder was never included in the data loop. Something to keep in mind. And this is the basic technology. You have a receiver antenna, which plugs into this base station, which is about the size of a paperback book, and then you had 5 motion sensors that just detect heat. Okay? No photos, just measuring heat of a body moving through a space. And they were designed to be placed strategically around the home. So this is one of my living lab homes where we, in parallel, studied the quiet care system. So you have one looking in the bedroom, the threshold to the bathroom, in the kitchen, and the medicine cabinet. And so here it just shows the sensors placed. These are the quiet care sensors. These are my own sensors for the living lab. And so we collected a bunch of data. First, let me show you here that it was really important that they have a gray indicator for the meds, a disclaimer that this information should not be construed as medical advice in any way. So while the data was presented in terms of the number of events, number of medication events in the day, they were not allowed to actually report it in terms of the lights. So here was the problem with quiet care. You know about the story of the boy who cried wolf? Well, there are various types of alerts that the system generated. And I collected data from these systems in parallel with my own sensor system, so I knew what was really going on over a period of 20 months. 2 types of alerts were called red alerts. Exiting the bedroom, rather, after 10 a.m., and not exiting the bathroom. And what we see over a period of 20 months are a lot of false positives, a lot of the boy crying wolf. So quiet care's value proposition to the adult children of an aging parent who is living independently was put this technology in your elder's home for peace of mind. Well, that's not exactly what the technology delivered, right? It externalized the cost of response on the family. Now, if the family was across town, not such a big deal. But if the family's across the country, it's a very big deal. Here's another example. Lively, dead but not gone. So here's a system that has been on the market for the past couple of years and now is no longer on the market. And now we've replaced the web-based dashboard with a modern app on a smartphone. And the Lively system used several sensors, just like quiet care, like one in a refrigerator, on the pillbox. These reported back to a hub. And they added to this what they called the Safe Watch, which did a number of things. It counted steps. It had a medical alert type call for help button on it. And it actually had an accelerometer in it. So if worn in a lanyard around the neck, it could detect falls. Lively was a San Francisco startup, and like many San Francisco startups, they didn't hit their marketing numbers, and they were sold. They were sold to a company called Great Call. If you look in the current edition of our beloved AARP magazine, on the inside cover, back page, you'll see this Lively, or now Great Call, wearable ad. And I took a look at this ad, and I said, wow, you know, it tracks steps to achieve goals, great. It has fall detection. I thought, well, fall detection, that's really interesting because I see this healthy woman with it on her wrist, but if you read the fine print, which with my poor eyesight I had to magnify here, it says fall detection functions only when the device is used with a specially designed lanyard that we provide you. Oh, okay. So you should keep in mind, whenever you're evaluating technology, read the fine print. Here's another example of a system that's currently on the market and one that I'm using. It's called the Sense Mother. Now, it's a little bit droll, as they say en français, because it's a French system. And it is droll. The hub is this mother, okay? Now, it turns out that her eyes and her smile are very useful. I know when my Comcast internet link goes down because Mom stopped smiling. My wife used to be at the computer saying, "Claude, would you please fix my computer? It's not working." And I now can yell up, "Well, is Mom smiling?" "No." "Oh, it's not my fault. It's Comcast, right? Network's down." Okay. So Mother System has smartphone apps and a web-based interface. And it uses these little sensors called cookies. This is a cookie. I carry this one in my pocket. It counts my steps. It also lets my home know when I'm home. And that has some utility, as we'll discuss in a moment. So you can put these sensors on anything. They're little battery-operated wireless sensors. They have an accelerometer and a thermometer in them. So, for example, you can put one on a medicine bottle or dispenser, and you can then set times of the day when a person's supposed to take their meds, and the system will detect whether or not they handled their medications at the appropriate times and issue alerts when the meds were missed. You can carry one in your pocket or purse, and it will count steps. And it'll show you your steps for today, and it'll show you your steps over the week or over the year if you care. You can put them on what we call artifacts, things around the house, like the TV remote control. And you can see people's patterns of activity watching TV. You can put one on the fridge, and you can see when a person is preparing meals and eating and snacking. One of the interesting applications is you can actually put one under the mattress pad of the bed. And there's an algorithm which can be used to detect whether a person's had a rough night's sleep with several trips to the bathroom, or whether they've had a relatively good night's sleep. And again, you can track this over weeks and months. And I've had clients who found this particular application very helpful for elders who were discharged from the hospital and weren't able to sleep comfortably in their bed at night. Anyway, this is all available very inexpensively today. Now let me tell you a little bit how I propose to use this technology. So back to this report to the President. There's an excerpt on page 11 that encapsulates the CareWheels Interdependent Care model. It reads, "A few examples illustrate technology's usefulness. Remote monitoring, wearables, and sensors can help seniors age in place while ensuring their safety and maintaining their health." Several sentences later, it says, "Online time banks can allow seniors to donate services now in order to accept help from others when they need it." Interesting. So the CareBank project that I'm going to tell you about next integrates TeleCare remote sensor monitoring and TimeBanking to convert our surplus human capital into shared social capital, empowering people to live interdependently, to take better care of each other, and uphold the social determinants of health. So here's how it works. Here's the app, okay? And I could show you on my smartphone, but it's probably easier to see it up here on the screen. So it has two aspects to it. The TeleCare part is an elder circle of peers. Now, each person would be at the center of their own circle. Okay, so if this were my app, I would be in the center, but this is Alice's so that I can see what I'm doing here. So the idea is to engage people in co-production of in-home care services. All right, co-production is a term back from the Tofflers from the third wave, this idea of cottage industry, being able to co-produce goods and services. The purpose is to provide mutual care to support our aging in place. And it's very simple the way it works. The background color determines the current state of each peer in the circle based on their sensor data. The time banking side values peers as assets, that we all have something to contribute. It converts human to social capital and monetizes care services to rebuild our core economy. And very interestingly, it automates the accounting and big data collection. So this would be of interest to qualitative social scientists who have great hypotheses but have to rely, for example, on self-reporting, journaling, and things like that in order to get answers to validate their hypotheses. This system automatically generates and collects TeleCare data and transactional data between people in the group. So you can ask and answer a lot of questions, and you can use this data to tweak the system over time, to evolve it. How many people are familiar with time banking? A few. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about it. It was developed by a guy named Edgar Kahn, who was Robert Kennedy's counsel. He went on to found Vista AmeriCorps under the Kennedy administration. He founded the Antioch School of Law in Washington, D.C., the first social justice law school. And then he had a major heart attack and a subsequent epiphany. His epiphany was this: we are a culture that feels really good about giving, not so much about receiving. When he was on the receiving end after his heart attack, he felt uncomfortable. But he realized that in order for giving to be effective, receiving had to be effective. We had to find some way to close the circle. And so he invented this idea of time banking, using time dollars instead of money dollars in order for people to exchange services. And the idea was to treat people as assets, not problems, since all people have something of value to contribute. To strengthen our core economy of family, friends, and community. By the way, the core economy takes the biggest hit during financial crisis and is the slowest to recover. So the technology that I'm proposing to you today is something that can be a stopgap in the event of financial crisis. It doesn't depend upon money to work. And it's based on reciprocity, the idea that what goes around comes around, so it makes good sense to pay it forward. When we tap all that people can do, we can replace scarcity with abundance. It's based on the golden rule, which you find in every religion. It's the universal operating principle. The Visiting Nurse Service of New York has had a time bank up and running for many years, and they find that this is the distribution of members used by age, and what you see is that the majority of people who use it, 2/3, are between 40 and 80 years old. Kind of interesting. This is another study that looked at data from a number of time banks, and what the researcher here discovered was that female non-seniors and female seniors are the heaviest users of time banks. This tends to mirror what the villages movement is finding, the kind of people who are most active in villages. Okay? So time banks would be a natural fit to intentional communities like villages. Let me explain to you how the CareBank works, the integration interaction. In the center, we have our CareWheels group, okay? And the background color, for example, my background is red here, indicates that a red alert has been generated. And that sends a push notice to the other members' devices, their smartphones, for instance. And all any member has to do is tap on my picture, and when they do so, they'll go to the TeleCare screen where they'll see the results of the sensors. Presence, am I home? You can't say very much about meals and meds if you can't determine whether the person's at home. Then we're also looking at meals and meds. And in this case, I hadn't eaten lunch and I had gone through the whole afternoon without eating. Now this may just mean that I'm on a diet or that I wasn't hungry, or after a preset number of hours, this yellow alert changed to a red alert. And the call button turned red, which means that any one of these members should tap that and give me a call, find out what's going on. Now, remember the problem with the medical alert buttons. Here's a way that the home is smart enough to tell somebody else to call in to try and resolve this anomaly. Now, while the members of the care wheel are doing this, in the background, they're receiving microcredits for their good works, both for monitoring and for the response. So, just to further this point, initially I was in a yellow alert status. There was a yellow alert on the call, which means a person could call me and check up to see how I'm doing if they wanted to, but after a set amount of time, that automatically went to a red alert, and push alerts were sent out to all members of the care wheel to check up on me. These are some advantages of care banking. It advances TeleCare by involving the beneficiaries as active subjects who are engaged in the mutual production of such services, rather than objectifying them as passive recipients. This was one of the big problems with most of the other systems on the market. They don't share the data with the elder. It empowers people living with disabilities and chronic health conditions, especially frail elders, with technologies to give and receive care services from the comfort of their homes. It engages people in meaningful work relationships that provide a renewed sense of purpose to the lives of people who may otherwise suffer from social isolation and its related comorbidities. Remember Laura's great teaching, how having meaning in one's life and social connection increases one's self-esteem and quality of life. It saves money and reduces needless suffering by preemptively averting crises to reduce the high cost of emergency room trips and prevent avoidable hospital readmissions. And it supports people who wish to live independently by networking them together to live more interdependently in their intentional communities, including NORCs and villages. So this idea of greater independence through interdependence has become the CareWheels mantra. And if we look at the great teachers of the world, the Dalai Lama says, within the context of our interdependence, self-interest clearly lies in considering the interests of others. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, the fundamental law of human beings is interdependence. A person is a person through other persons. This is how we can use technology to achieve these objectives. So going back to the theme of the day, disrupt aging, remind you what Bill Thomas said, that the best new ideas are the ones with the most potential to disrupt and transform the experience of care and caregiving, are also the most likely to be rejected out of hand. So what do you think? Is the CareBank such an insane idea? Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay. Leonard Nimoy said it simply and best. Live long and prosper. As an old man, he also said, the miracle is this. The more we share, the more we have. So, let's take better care of ourselves by taking good care of each other. Thank you. Time for some Q&A?
So I really appreciate the peer design, peer design, and respect that, but the villages model, I mean, part of the problem sometimes in its implementations, people are aging out of being able to live here.
Right.
So I wonder about the new generation application of what you're doing.
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking. And I've had this conversation with Rachel Olivier. What I would ask the board of any village is, given that you're promising your membership that they're going to be able to age in place in their own homes for as long as possible, what does that really mean? And how might technology be able to prolong the ability of people to age in place in their own homes and community? So I think the intergenerational model makes a lot of sense. When I first did the Pine Point project, I was working with younger people, pre-senescent people with severe disabilities. And one of the things we did was I gave a presentation to Governor Kitzhaber's Future of Aging and Disability Services. And I met a manager of a home care company, and she hired my participants to begin providing care to frail elders in the community, just in the form of wellness calls. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for intergenerational and intergroup type of support. If you study social capital, there's two types of social capital. There's what's called bonding capital, where you're engaged in reciprocal relationships with people in your own peer group. Okay? And there's something called bridging capital, which is the intergenerational type, where you're actually bridging to different groups. And bridging turns out to be much more powerful. It's a much more powerful model to build a TimeBank, for instance. So one of the problems that Edgar Kahn identified with TimeBanks is people don't know what services they have to offer each other. And oftentimes the things that they come up with are not highly valued in our society. Well, in-home care is going to become a more and more valuable service because there are fewer and fewer people to do it. In fact, I've spoken to home care managers, and they're simultaneously feeling pressure to grow while they're facing ridiculous turnover rates, churn rates among their employees. So it's an industry that is really having trouble growing to meet the needs. And if we can up-level their skill sets with this kind of technology, I think we can avoid some caregiver burnout. We can spread the caregiving burden around to peers as well as familial and professional care providers, and basically learn to do more with what we've got. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.